Hello to everyone and welcome to Be Like Christ. Welcome to Psalm 114. We talked about in our last study how Psalm 113 through Psalm 118 were psalms that were sung or used during the celebration of the Passover feast for the Israelites or for the Jews later on. And so we're kind of in that series, and we'll see in Psalm 114 that the subject matter of Psalm 114 really fits into that Passover theme. But before we get there in our outline, let's first open up with our PDF, which you can download on our website. It's free. There's a link down in the description. Let's talk, as we always do, about our author. We do not know the author of Psalm 114, and also for our second section, New Testament references, I don't have any for today. If you want to think about one overarching theme for Psalm 114, it would probably be this: the natural world trembles at the presence of God and obeys his commands. And I want to take a look at one word to understand it a little bit better. And this is one that we've touched on before, but in case you weren't with us for those studies, you'll see it in verse 1, and it's the name Jacob. Okay, so who was Jacob? You may remember from the book of Genesis. Jacob was the grandson of Abraham, and he was the grandson of Abraham. No, wait, yes. Grandson of Abraham. Maybe I should just read it off my notes. Jacob was the grandson of Abraham and the son of Isaac. Jacob was the father of the 12 patriarchs. These were the men who the 12 tribes of Israel would take their names from. I mean, you remember Jacob's name was changed to Israel by God, and that's how the nation gets their name. Since he was the father of the nation of Israel, his name is sometimes used to refer to the nation collectively. So we're not really talking about just Jacob the man here, but really what came from him, the nation of Israel. So his name is used to refer to the nation as a whole. You'll see it used that way in Psalm 114, verse 1. So when you hear Jacob in this chapter, just think the nation of Israel. Okay, it's outline time. Let's talk about our 8 verses for today. I've titled them "Tremble, O Earth, at the Presence of the Lord." That comes directly from the text. So as I mentioned, Psalm 113 through 118 were used as part of the Feast of Passover that was celebrated every year. So it makes sense that being a Passover psalm, the author of Psalm 114 touches on things and events that immediately followed the exodus of the people of Israel from the land of Egypt. When the people of Israel left Egypt right after that very first Passover, God went with them and his presence was in their camp. And in Psalm 114, the writer discussed how the geological features of the earth responded when God's presence approached them. And so what he's drawing on here is the history of Israel and the history of them in the wilderness after they left Egypt. And you can read about that in books like Exodus and Numbers. And so if you're not familiar with some of the history that we're going to talk about, you can go back. And we're also going to touch on some things in the book of Joshua. So I've included references where I can. But let's talk about these geological, natural features of the earth that responded to God's presence and to his words. So the Red Sea, that's probably the most famous one. The Red Sea split, or the text says that it fled, the waters fled, allowing the people to cross on dry land and allowing the people to escape the Egyptians. You can read about that in Exodus chapter 14. We also have the psalmist writing that the mountains and the hills, things that you would usually think of as being very fixed, founded or stable, they were unsettled when the Lord's presence approached them. Figuratively, they skipped like rams, the hills like lambs, according to verse 4. Maybe a reference there to Mount Sinai. There was an earthquake in Mount Sinai. You can think of the mountain jumping or moving when it's typically stable because of the effects of this earthquake. He may be thinking about that here. I'm not exactly sure. He mentions rocks that were turned into pools of water in verse 8, and by this the author was probably referring to the numerous times that God brought water out of rocks to satisfy his thirsty people in the wilderness when they didn't have any water. And then, lastly, the Jordan River turned back when God stopped its waters to permit the Israelites and the Ark of the Covenant to pass over into the Promised Land. You can read about that in Joshua chapter 3, verse 13. So the psalmist concludes writing that it was appropriate. It was the appropriate response of the natural world to tremble at the presence of God. These natural things are created, right, and they responded appropriately to the one who created them. They show great respect, great obedience to him. All right, so that's great for mountains and the Jordan River and stuff and how they respond to God, but what are we going to learn from that? Well, I found an interesting fact that I think it can give us an idea of the power, the enormity of something like the Red Sea. And, hopefully that humbles us, realizing that we're very, very much smaller than that. And it will help us to respond appropriately when we hear God's words. So here's my fact that I found. There are 61 sextillion gallons of water in the Red Sea. Now, that's 61 followed by 21 zeros. I wasn't even sure that that had a name, but it does. And you can look it up on Google. I don't know what that is in liters. It's a lot more. But the Red Sea has 61 sextillion gallons of water in it. And here's what we know, and here's what this psalm is telling us, that every droplet of that water trembles at the presence of the Lord and awaits his words to comply with his every command. And here's what we need to learn from that. If our response to the words of the Lord is any different from that of the Red Sea, then we are terribly mistaken about who we are and our proper place in God's universe.